the smartest being in the known universe, has a box in his garage. And across the entire series, the show never once puts him in front of it with the lid open. That is not forgetfulness. The box is labeled plainly, time travel stuff, Rick Sanchez, a man who will break physics for a better morning belch, walks past it for years. He also says the rule out loud, more than once, in his own words. He does not do time travel. We are going to get to why, not right away, and not because the subject is minor, but because that box is one of a whole row of them. Boxes the show has been carefully placing around its own world for 9 seasons and never quite opening. I have a theory about this, and tonight I want to walk it with you, step by step. Rick and Morty looks like a cartoon about a belching genius and his grandson chasing each other across universes for the next ridiculous escapade. What it actually does, season after season, is one single thing. It builds an iron rule. Do not touch the past, do not doubt yourself, trust your own memory. And then, methodically, episode by episode, it shows you what happens when the rule gets broken anyway. Tonight we go through those breakages in 4 large chapters. Identity and copies, time and causality, memory and self-knowledge, choice and the ethics of fiction. And behind each one we will find a real philosophical or psychological paradox invented by people hundreds and sometimes thousands of years before the first green humanoid with a portal gun appeared on a screen. What caught me in this is that the matches are too exact to be accidental. The show does not look like something written with a metaphysics textbook open on the desk, and yet again and again it trips over precisely the questions philosophers have been arguing about for centuries. This runs about an hour and a half, and it is made to fall asleep to. Every chapter stands on its own, so if you drop off in the middle, you can come back anywhere in the morning and lose nothing. If a breakdown like this one is good to fall asleep to, subscribe. I make them regularly. One thing before we start. Somewhere in the next hour and a half I am going to get something wrong. An episode number off by 1. A line handed to the wrong character. A philosopher's date misremembered. Over a breakdown this long, it happens. If you catch it, leave me a line in the comments. I read all of them, and I am glad to talk about any part of this. We will bring the box back into frame later. We begin with the most direct case in the whole thing, a man who may never have existed as a single copy at all. Section 1. Rick offers Beth something that looks at first like a gift and turns out to be a trap with no way out of it. He can make an exact copy of her, and he says so in exactly those words, a perfect instance of you with all your memories, an exact copy in every way, same voice, same habits, same childhood anxiety. Beth has been carrying around for decades. One version stays home, raises the kids, makes peace with Jerry over breakfast. The other one leaves for space, not with her father though. Rick is not going anywhere. He's half of the arrangement, the smaller and colder than that. You could be gone a day, a week, or the rest of your life with 0 consequences. The moment you decide to come back, I flip a switch and the clone's job is done. He stays in the garage. His role in the deal is the switch. The scene itself is pointedly ordinary. No dramatic music, no close-up on tears. Rick lays out the procedure roughly the way he would lay out the technical specification of a new device. Beth agrees. The copying happens off-screen, with no visual emphasis whatsoever on the moment of splitting, as though the show were deliberately refusing to grant the weight of an event to something that changes absolutely everything. The offer lands directly on Beth's oldest wound, and it is worth being precise about what that wound actually is, because it is not the one people usually name. Beth is a horse surgeon. That is not a joke about a rundown clinic on the edge of town. It is a serious, respected specialty, serious enough that she is offered a promotion described as going from horse surgeon straight past human surgeon to head of medicine. The wound is not that her work is small. The wound is that it was never the work she meant to do. You always wanted to be a real surgeon, the show tells her, and the pregnancy that closed off the other road gets named just as bluntly in the middle of a family fight. What if that loser Jerry hadn't talked me out of the abortion? Well, now you know, you'd be a doctor. She was 17. An ordinary choice would have meant sacrificing one life to get the other. The clone removes that necessity entirely. Neither version has to choose. Both get a whole life, just different halves of the same one. The gift works because it is aimed at real pain that has been accumulating for 20 years. Which of the two is the real Beth? The question feels natural, almost reflexive. We ask it of any clone story before the opening titles are done, but the show will not answer it, and not because it ignores the question. It devotes an entire scene to it seasons later, with Rick holding out a vial and offering to settle the matter once and for all, and then closing the whole thing with a shrug of a line. Switcheroo, which one's which? By the 9th season, the not knowing has become a running joke the characters make at each other's expense. Because that is where the whole trick lives. If the show opened its cards, the question of identity would collapse into an ordinary plot twist. A solution you could write down and close the notebook on. The refusal is not writer's laziness, and it is not a hook left dangling for a future season. The creators have been handed this question at conventions and in interviews for years, and they keep declining to close it. Dan Harmon at Paleyfest in 2020 put it about as clearly as it can be put. She's Schrodinger's Beth right now. If you have been rewatching that episode looking for the clue that tells you which Beth left and which one stayed, you have been looking for something that was never in the frame and is not going to be. The family does not flinch either. When the truth surfaces in conversation, nobody reacts with the horror you would expect from people learning that their mother might be a carefully manufactured copy. Summer's response is to point out, with some delight, that they now have two badass moms. For a show that stages full-scale domestic meltdowns over far smaller provocations, the calm here is genuinely strange. The irony extends to Rick, and here too, the popular version of it needs correcting. Rick is often quoted as saying that personality is an illusion, a temporary pattern of chemical reactions. He does not say that. What people call love, he says, is just a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed, and the famous formula everybody assigns to him, the one about nobody existing on purpose and nobody belonging anywhere and everybody dying, is not his line at all. That is Morty talking to his sister in a garage, offering her the worst comfort available. The nihilism people credit to Rick is partly borrowed from his grandson. What Rick actually does with the Beth question is stranger than any slogan. He does not hide the answer from his family. He does not have it. He removed it from himself, deliberately, and he names the exact thing he took out, the memory of which Beth is real and which Beth is a clone, obviously. Summer sees the size of that immediately. You mind blew yourself. You literally don't even know which of your daughters is real. The most committed nihilist in the show found one question unbearable enough to erase the answer to it out of his own head, and then his family declined to go looking for it either. At that point, the question changes its nature. It stops asking about a fact, which of the two is the real one, and starts asking about a category, which metaphysical frame we are prepared to apply to a situation that gives us nothing to apply it to. If a copy is indistinguishable from the original in every respect, in memory, in anxiety, in the specific way she gets angry at Jerry, in how she hugs Summer before school, then what is the question supposed to mean? It assumes a standard exists somewhere, something you could hold both versions against to find the difference. There is no standard. There are two histories, identical up to a single second and diverging afterward into two different lives, both of them entirely genuine from the inside. Asking which one is real is like asking which of two identical printings of a book is the real book when the text is the same and only the readers differ. What changes in the second case is scale. Cloning Beth is a story about two people. The story of the decoy Smith families is the same problem, multiplied by dozens of lives, built in advance and maintained carefully, like an insurance policy against catastrophe. Fearing the enemies who will eventually reach his real family, Rick quietly builds an entire network of backup Smiths, other Jerrys, other Beths, other Mortys and Summers. Each version lives a full life, indistinguishable from the original in every way a life can be measured. Jobs, arguments, birthdays, dull Tuesday dinners. Do the decoys know their decoys, someone asks, and the answer comes back exactly as you would expect. They wouldn't be very good decoys if they did, which holds right up until they do. The moment a decoy learns what it is, the entire architecture comes apart, because every decoy has quietly been building decoys of its own. Rick has a name for what happens next. He calls it an Asimov cascade, and it ends with copies hunting and exterminating each other across the map. Consider what that system has to be to work at all. This is not one spare double kept in a closet. This is a production line, standing ready to push the next family forward the instant the previous one is destroyed. Technically, it reads as an extended solution to a security problem. Functionally, it is complete infrastructure for interchangeability, something like a backup generator wired in against a power cut, except with the entire spectrum of human feeling running inside it, including the capacity to fear a death none of the copies knows is coming. The deaths are shown in passing, and they are shown as comedy. A decoy family is wiped out in place of the real one. There is a flash, and the episode has moved on before the shot has time to settle. No close-up, no musical sting, no pause for grief. That carelessness is what gives away the actual subject. The show leaves the question of who is more real, original, or copy entirely alone. It is interested in something else, which is that the category of more real breaks down at any scale larger than one, and that the ease with which we normally use that category survives only because we have never had to hold ourselves up against a literal duplicate. What does that say about the man who built the system? He is not present for any of these deaths. He gets a signal that another line of defense has done its job, and he moves to the next problem. The distance is part of the design. If Rick had to watch each of those deaths personally, maintaining the system would become psychologically impossible even for him. He builds his protection at a cost he prefers not to examine closely. The architecture of the operation protects him too, specifically his ability to keep extending it without buckling under the weight of what he is actually doing. There is one decoy who does get to say something about it, and what he says is worse than any grief scene the show declined to shoot. I could tell I was a fake from the day I was born. Another turns the same realization into something close to a creed, delivered as a rallying cry to a room full of copies, brought into the world by an unloving God and driven to destroy ourselves by the uncertainty he creates. These are jokes, written in the rhythm of jokes, and they are also the most accurate description of the situation that anyone in the episode manages to produce. That is probably the most uncomfortable detail in this whole chapter. The suffering of a duplicate family does not become less real because the family was manufactured later for a utilitarian purpose without the knowledge of its own members. The show is built so that the viewer almost never sits with such a scene long enough for the conclusion to arrive, and that may be the only reason the entire enterprise stays watchable. Fans have spent years arguing on forums about which Beth from the garage scene is the real one, assembling episode timelines, combing through Rick's and Jerry's lines for a slip. There is something funny about that, because the entire point of the scene is that the argument cannot end with one side winning. People spend evenings solving a mystery, the show engineered to be unsolvable, roughly the way you would investigate which of two identical cups of coffee was poured first. Long after both have been drunk, nobody sits Jerry down and offers him a choice the way Beth was offered one. He's simply swapped. Somewhere off screen, in the course of yet another interdimensional mix-up, the family picks up a different version of Jerry from a different reality. And for a long stretch of time nobody notices, including Beth. The difference from Beth's case matters, and it is not the difference people usually state. It is often said that the new Jerry has nothing in common with the old one. That is not quite right, and the truth is more unsettling than the exaggeration. The replacement comes from a nearly identical reality, where he lived nearly the same life, with his own Beth and his own children in his own version of the same house. The shared biography is there in full. It is just a biography assembled out of different instances of the same people. Beth knew a split had occurred and only had to wonder which of the two versions she was. The Jerry case removes even that. There is no moment of division to point at because there was no division. There were two parallel copies of one life, and one of them quietly took over the other. The characters, once they learn the truth, get away with mild surprise. The show treats it as a curiosity rather than a catastrophe. A shrug, a joke, on to the next scene. If it had staged the substitution of a human being as an actual disaster, we would have seen denial, horror, a long process of acceptance. Instead, we get a reaction wildly out of proportion to the event, and that mismatch is itself part of the message. The audience, meanwhile, was sitting in exactly the same position as the family. Episodes with this Jerry aired for seasons before the fact of the swap ever surfaced in the plot, and the whole time the viewers took him for a single, continuous character. The gap between the fiction and the watching of it collapses here. The same ignorance Beth is living inside the story is being lived by the person in front of the screen, right up until the show decides to interrupt it. What does that mean for Jerry, the one this Beth loves, these children call father, and this Rick tolerates at the same table? By origin, he is a different man. He was not part of their life at the start, but by function, in every sense that matters to the running of a household, he is their Jerry. The function carried over intact, the origin changed without anyone noticing, and life simply continued as though nothing had happened, because for everyone taking part in it, nothing had. The personal angle belongs to Beth. She built a marriage, raised 2 children, spent decades beside a man she sincerely believed was the same Jerry she got pregnant with in high school. If that man is technically someone else, then what was she actually loving all those years? A specific person with a unique history, or the role of husband, performed convincingly enough that the difference never surfaced. The show does not make her answer out loud, but the mere availability of the question changes how we are obliged to understand her marriage in retrospect. And Jerry, for once, is ahead of everyone. He is the one who works it out, and he works it out loudly in a single unbroken burst. How did I end up not in my own universe? Oh my God, the Jerry Boree. The character the show keeps as its designated fool is the first person in the house to correctly identify his own metaphysical situation. Nobody sat him down and told him, he noticed, the story is not about a man too dim to see what happened to him. It is about a family that never bothered to check. A wedding. A short burst of gunfire. And Rick's oldest friend goes down, not shielding anyone, not dying heroically in some defensive act, but shot by his own bride at the altar in the middle of his own celebration. Tammy is a Federation agent, and she has been one the entire time. What we hear is Rick arriving at the understanding one clause too late. Tammy, what are you doing? Sit your bird ass down. Tammy. Birdperson. No. The dad sounds final. In this show, it almost never stays final for long. The name the resurrected thing ends up with is worth pausing on, because it is not the solemn mythological label it is usually taken for. The phoenix burns and returns from the ash, and yes, Birdperson does pass through the destruction of his body and reconstruction in an entirely new physical form, but the show is not reaching for the myth. It mocks the name to its face. In the same scene, the name is announced. I am Phoenixperson, he says. Phoenixperson, is that what we settled on? I thought we all agreed on Cyberbird. And then the conversation gives up on itself entirely, with a shrug and a who cares. Even the branding of the resurrection is a committee decision nobody was happy with. He comes back a long time later, fully restored by alien technology inside the body of a giant mechanical bird. The memory survived without loss. He remembers the wedding, remembers Rick, remembers his own death. Physically, almost nothing of the former self remains, not the familiar silhouette, not the familiar voice, not one detail of appearance the eye could catch and hold on to, and the family does not accept him. This is the part that gets softened in retellings. There is no gradual warming, no accumulation of small recognitions, no old joke landing at the right moment and cracking somebody's guard. The family refuses, in every register available to them. Birdperson, someone says, and the machine corrects them. It is now Phoenix Person. The reply is not recognition, it is an accusation. You're working for them. What did they do to you, BP? The new name gets nothing but contempt. No one's calling you that. Dumb. And later, in the middle of a fight meant to end with his destruction, they are still refusing the label while swinging at the body wearing it. Step back. You're not killing him till we kick his ass, Birdperson. They keep the old name and try to kill the new machine in the same breath. Nothing is accumulating here. Recognition is being actively withheld. In the 17th century, the English philosopher John Locke proposed a criterion that looks simple and remains contested to this day. What makes a person the same person across time is not the body, but the continuity of consciousness and memory. Move a man's consciousness into an entirely different body, keeping his memory and his sense of being himself. And by Locke's account, it is that consciousness you should call the same person. He illustrated the idea with something close to science fiction in the second edition of his essay. In 1694, if the consciousness of a prince was somehow transferred into the body of a cobbler, memory intact, then what stands before you is still the prince, just wearing someone else. 3.5 centuries later, a cartoon about a mad scientist and his grandson runs the same experiment, except that the cobbler is a giant mechanical bird. Ask yourself what would convince you personally to recognize a friend inside that body: the shape of the beak, or the fact that he still remembers your wedding better than you do. Now notice that the family on screen answered that question the other way. They looked at the body and they said no. So the show does not settle this by consensus. And that is exactly why it settles it more firmly than any warm scene of acceptance could have. What brings Birdperson back is not the family and not the body. It is Rick, walking alone by a route that only makes sense if Locke was right. He goes inside his friend's memory, walks around in it, and pulls him out of it, treating the stored past as the place where the person is actually kept. He says it out loud before he starts. Rule 1, he says, all this can be fixed unless I lose Birdperson. Everything else in that operation is negotiable, and memory is where he goes looking. The Lockean answer in this show rests on nobody's agreement. It rests on the fact that the person turned out to be located in the memory, and that the smartest character in the series went straight to that address without stopping to justify it. He acted as though it were obvious. The family, meanwhile, was still arguing about the name, which leaves one object in that garage untouched. A cardboard box labeled time travel stuff has been sitting there for years, in the background of scene after scene, and the show has never once put Rick's hands on it. That is not a dramatic refusal. It is a running visual gag nobody in the house comments on. The rule behind it, though, does get spoken, plainly and more than once. I don't do time travel, he says, flatly, the way you would state a dietary restriction. Working out who is the real one here has turned out, as we have just seen, to be a question. This show is comfortable, holding open or closing at will. The question of when exactly now begins and whether then can be touched at all is going to go considerably worse. Section 2. The box stood in the garage long enough to gather dust a finger deep, and the whole time it stood there, a couple of meters away, the show kept proving that it knows exactly what to do with time. Just not through the door with the label on it. The label says, time travel stuff. The creators made that promise at the start, and it sounded almost like an engineering decision. No time travel as a working tool of the plot, because if a character can go back at any moment and rewrite a loss, then every loss on screen stops being a real price and turns into a temporary inconvenience. The whole dramatic structure of this show rests on one simple support. What happened cannot be undone with a single jump backwards. Knock that support out, and the meaning of almost every heavy scene in the series goes with it. The promise was kept almost literally. Almost. There is a crystal, and it does not move anyone a single second forward or backward along the axis of time. It does something stranger than that. It shows you how you die. Death crystals show you how you're gonna die. And that is the entire specification. What you see is not one death, but a spread of them, and the spread shifts as you change your mind about what to do next. And the crystal is not in Rick's hands. Morty takes one and keeps it, and Rick spends the whole episode on the other side of the argument. First the suspicion, Morty, do you have a death crystal in your pocket? Then, once the thing is already steering everything, I see you appear to be holding a death crystal that's guiding your decisions more than I am. That is the real mechanism of the episode. Morty finds one picture of the future among the deaths on offer, decides that this is the one he wants, and from that moment every decision he makes is built backwards from it. Not toward a good life, toward keeping one particular ending reachable. The trick sits in the wording of the original rule. The rule forbade movement along the axis of time. Nobody said anything about knowing where the axis leads. The crystal lives in exactly that gap. It does not rewrite the past, and it does not send anyone forward physically. It simply lets you see the outcomes before the scene happens for real, and then act on what you saw. And here the show does something better than the loophole deserves. It charges for it. A saved game reloaded costs nothing at all. This costs bodies. Morty, steering by his own preferred ending, leaves a trail of them behind him, and the line that lands at the end of that trail is addressed straight to Rick. You said the crystals wouldn't hurt anyone, Dad. The foreknowledge was free, the steering was not. Run the thought experiment anyway. Suppose that crystal were permanently available for any scene without exception. Very quickly, there would be no reason left to fear for anyone on screen, because every loss would turn into a rough draft to be rewritten on the next take. The device works only because it appears once, at a single point, exactly where the plot finds it convenient. Make it an everyday background tool and the trick stops working immediately. The show seems to feel that danger, and after the episode the crystal goes back into the cupboard. It never returns in that role in any serious way. Notice that the show punishes its characters with death, with loss, with wrecked relationships on a regular schedule, and not once does it let them walk back to the crystal to preview an outcome again and choose a better script. The right to look ahead is issued one time, like a single-use license. It never becomes a standing instrument for managing fate. That rarity is what keeps the trick safe for the drama. Apply it daily, and no plot in this show would hold any tension at all. The classic formulation of the problem underneath all this is older than the phrase science fiction. A traveler goes into the past and kills his own grandfather before his father is born. If the grandfather is dead, the father is never born, so the traveler is never born either. And if the traveler never existed, there was nobody to kill the grandfather. The grandfather, it turns out, must have survived. A closed circle with no consistent solution, where every answer immediately cancels its own condition. Try running that chain to the end in your own head. Sooner or later, the logic ties itself into a knot that cannot be undone from the inside. The show walks right up to that circle exactly once, and it does it in the most absurd setting available. A snake civilization invents time travel. Having invented it, the snakes do what any civilization in this genre does with the technology, which is send an assassin back to kill a child. The ape child must be eliminated to protect our timeline. There is a time police force and even a human officer to register the situation on our behalf. Snakes? Time travel? They did what? This is real travel inside one continuous timeline with a loop that feeds on itself, and it is not hidden behind a neighboring universe. The episode is Rattlestar Reclactica, and it is the closest this show ever comes to the grandfather. Notice how Rick settles it, not with a paradox, and not by winning an argument with causality, with overload. He hands the snakes technology earlier than their civilization is ready to hold it, and then he steps back and lets snake time travel eat its own tail. The loop is not resolved, it is fed until it consumes itself. That is a very different move from solving the problem, and it is the only move the show is willing to make. Everywhere else the pattern is to swap. Whenever the logic is about to run into that dead end, the story quietly changes the scenery. Instead of one timeline rewritten after the fact, a neighboring separate universe walks on stage, one where the required outcome already exists on its own, ready-made, needing no intervention at all. The past stays untouched. A second shelf simply appears beside it with the result already sitting on it. Going around a paradox is cheaper than solving one, and the show takes the detour nearly every time. And notice who is never inside the loop. In the snake episode, the tail eating belongs to the snakes. Rick arranges it, watches it, and stays outside it. What would happen if the creators finally put a Rick face to face with a version of himself from another point in his own chronology instead of another ready-made alternative universe? Nothing good, if the logic of the paradox is to be trusted, and the show seems to prefer not to test that logic on its own material. Breeding neighboring worlds is safer than making one timeline collide with itself. The grandfather stays unkilled, back to the box itself. The capabilities Rick demonstrates in other episodes suggest that whatever is inside it could undo almost any of his central losses. Diane's death. The moment when a brilliant scientist began turning into a man organically incapable of letting anyone close. He has the technical means. He has had decades to use them, and the show never once puts him in front of that box with the lid open. Notice how rarely Rick shows restraint of that kind anywhere else. He will break physics, erase somebody's memory without asking, build a weapon out of whatever internal organs are nearby, and at the same time keep his distance for years from one cardboard box in his own garage, as if it held something capable of destroying him more thoroughly than any enemy he has ever faced. Everything else in his life yields to repair, to replacement, to a new invention overnight. The box stays unchanged longer than anything else in that garage, including, it seems, his own principles about everything else. The first reading is simple. Rick, who in every other area of life recognizes almost no rule at all, moral or physical or familial, observes his own restriction here with something close to religious strictness, simply because he decided once that this door is closed. He keeps his word to himself, even though nobody but him could ever check whether he kept it. For a character who built a career on breaking every conceivable boundary, that is a rare moment of genuine discipline. Ask yourself how that discipline actually differs from an ordinary fear of touching something that more or less works, because there is a darker reading available. If Rick opens the box and genuinely repairs the past, saves Diane, stops his own retreat into the shell long before it ever happens, then the man who walks out of the garage with the mended timeline is no longer the Rick who walked into it. The old one was broken exactly enough to reach for the box in the first place. The new one, with the past corrected, would never have been broken enough to make that decision. Saving the past would mean erasing the only version of himself who was ever willing to save it. Almost the same closed circle as the grandfather turned inward into a single biography instead of two different people. Which of the two readings would Rick pick if somebody asked him straight out? The show has been willing to keep arguing with itself elsewhere. Here it does not argue at all, and the box stays sealed from the first episode to the last. A neighboring story takes the same logic to the point of absurdity, and it starts from something much smaller than a crystal. Rick freezes time to clean up a mess, and when he unfreezes it, an argument left over from the frozen stretch is still running. It is a genuinely tiny argument, whose job it was to put the mattress under Mr. Benson. It was Summer's job to put the mattress under. It was your job, Morty. Nah. You, huh? Two teenagers refusing to concede a point that could not matter less, and reality around them splits in two. This is not a wordless miracle, and the show is precise about it. Rick names the physics on the spot, in the weary tone of a man who has seen this failure mode before. This is why you don't freeze time, you guys. Then comes the diagnosis. Our time is fractured. You two somehow created a feedback loop of uncertainty that split our reality into two equally possible impossibilities. There is equipment involved, there is an explanation, and there is a stated cause. The uncertainty is not a metaphor here, it is the mechanism. From that second, there are two separate worlds, physically distinct, differing in exactly one detail, how that particular argument ended, and it does not stay at two. the branches keep opening, and by the peak of the episode, the count reaches 64 nearly identical versions of the same afternoon. The split is also narrower than it sounds. Beth and Jerry are not in it. Only 3 people are. We're not on any timeline dummy. And more precisely, the 3 of us are lost in a timeless oblivion. Your parents get to exist. The rest of the house carries on inside one single reality, while 3 of its members are scattered across dozens of copies of an afternoon. Then the episode refuses the comfortable version of its own idea. Uncertainty is not a stable state to live in. Rick says so plainly, uncertainty is inherently unsustainable. Eventually, everything either is or isn't, and he puts a clock on it. About 4 hours to land on the side of is. The branches are not a permanent escape hatch. They are a condition with a deadline, and it lands. At the end, the branches collapse back into a single line, 64 possible afternoons compressed into one dot on the screen, and Morty walks out of it carrying the whole pile. It's hard to keep straight now that I have 63 other memories of everything. That is the price the episode actually charges. Not a lost timeline. A head with 63 extra versions of the same day inside it. Imagine, for a second, that one small domestic argument with your brother or sister could physically split the afternoon into 64 slightly different versions, and that all 64 would then be pushed back into one head, yours with the memories intact. That is not an escape from consequences. That is consequence delivered in bulk. Technically, none of this is time travel, and none of it is time travel undone. Functionally, it looks at first like the same machinery for dodging outcomes, pushed further than the death crystal ever tried to go. If a sufficiently stubborn disagreement can produce a separate universe, then no decision is final in the way it is final for the viewer sitting in front of the screen. Somewhere there is always a version where the other choice was made, and when literally every outcome exists. None of them feels earned, except that the episode closes that door itself. The branches are unstable by design, the clock runs, and eventually everything either is or isn't. The show built the perfect consequence. Free machine and then wrote in out loud the rule that makes it collapse. The central finite curve looks like an impersonal law of the universe, a boundary drawn by reality itself, with nobody's hand anywhere near it. In fact, it was built, and the canon is careful about the wording. They built a wall around infinity, plural. The show does not hand us one author to blame, and the plural is doing real work here, because a wall raised by a committee of one man's copies is a stranger object than a wall raised by a single villain. And what the wall separates is not a room. That is the detail the show is precise about, and that paraphrase usually blurs. They separated all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes where he's the smartest man in the universe. The unit is not a conversation or a laboratory. The unit is a universe, and the quantity is infinite on both sides of the wall. The fear being managed is not the fear of being out-argued by somebody in the same building. It is the fear that inside an infinite set there is a smarter one, and the answer was to cut the infinite set in half. The mechanism is not surveillance either. Nobody is tracking individual versions of Rick across realities and clipping the wings of the dangerous ones. The universes themselves were selected. Everything inside the curve was chosen for the property of containing a Rick who comes out on top, which means every Rick inside it has spent his entire life inside a result that was settled before he was born. Evil Morty described the result. Every version of us has spent every version of all of our lives in one infinite crib. A crib, he says, built around one infinite baby. There is an irony in the fact that the resulting system protects exactly the trait that produced the fear in the first place. Warlick sees so, that Rick stays the smartest one available, and by existing it proves that somewhere out there are versions of him capable of being smarter. There would be nothing to fortify against otherwise. This is the right place to recall the old argument about free will. If every event, including the decision you are making right now, grew out of a chain of causes that started long before you were born, Is there room in that chain for real freedom, or is freedom only the sensation of somebody who does not suspect his own predetermination? Usually, the argument stays abstract, a convenient thing to discuss, impossible to prove or disprove in practice. The show makes that abstraction literal and physical in one move. The boundary of your freedom is not a metaphor and not a philosophical construction. It is a material wall, put up at a specific moment by specific people, frightened of a specific thing, and nobody told you it was there. Every Rick inside the central finite curve is sincerely convinced that he is cleverer than almost everything around him, because almost everything around him was pre-selected on exactly that criterion, universe by universe. The freedom of thought he is so proud of is freedom of movement inside a pen, and the fence was built by other instances of his own face. If the curve is a story about freedom trimmed by somebody else's fear, then the Council of Ricks is a story about what happens when identical minds are gathered in one hall with nothing trimmed at all. And the first thing to get right about the Council is that it is not a parliament, it is a tribunal. It arrests, it tries, it sentences, and it does all of that in the name of every dimension at once. You are under arrest for crimes against alternate Ricks by the authority of the Trans-Dimensional Council of Ricks, police work performed by a man upon himself. The parliamentary machinery arrives later, and only after the council has been destroyed. You'll be happy to know that the council's gone now. What grows on the ruins is a democracy with campaigns, candidates, and a countdown. Just one day remains before our newly democratic citadel elects its first president. And that election is where the real experiment happens, because the electorate and the candidates are, at the starting line, the same person, the same intellect, the same biography, up to the moment of divergence. Unanimity would be the reasonable expectation. The result is the opposite. Candidates identical down to the last cell are sorted into hostile camps almost immediately. They run on incompatible promises, and the population of copies splits along those lines with the same competitive appetite you would find in any human election assembled out of completely different people. And the winner, in the end, is not a Rick at all. It is a Morty. In 1951, the economist Kenneth Arrow proved a theorem that has been troubling everyone who tries to design a perfect voting system ever since, where there are 3 or more options on the table and voters rank them in order of preference. No procedure can reliably turn those individual rankings into a single rational collective decision without breaking at least one of a short list of basic fairness conditions. One of those conditions says that if every single voter prefers option A to option B, then the collective choice has to prefer A as well. Perfect voting does not exist in principle, no matter how carefully it is designed in advance. The Citadel takes that theorem to caricature. Even when every voter in the hall started out as literally the same person, with the same body, the same past, the same second of birth, the modest portion of different experience, accumulated after the split, turns out to be enough to produce exactly the political fracture that normally appears between complete strangers. Identical starting conditions do not save anyone, not from politics, and apparently not from the nature of collective choice itself. What use is an identical point of departure if a year later there are 2 different people standing in front of you who used to be one and the same? All of this has been standing on a single question: when? Whether the past can be touched at all, whether any fork is ever final, whether freedom exists outside somebody's personal wall that you never knew was there. What comes next changes the axis of the question from when to what you actually know about your own life. It opens on a scene where parasites move fake friends into a family's house, complete with carefully written shared memories of years of friendship that never happened, and hidden inside that same scene is one small detail that gives the whole deception away. If a breakdown like this one is good to fall asleep to, subscribe. I make them regularly. Section 3. The first infected guest turns up in the kitchen doorway so casually that nobody in the room thinks to look at him twice. The spore that produced him did not come aboard a ship and did not drift in through a vent. Rick's own guess, offered once the house is already full of strangers, is far more ordinary than that. Somebody probably tracked it in last week, on the bottom of their shoe, on a piece of alien fruit. That is the entire delivery system. A piece of fruit, A shoe? A kitchen floor? What the sport does after that is where the cleverness lives. Instead of planting one false memory, it unfolds a whole network around its victim. It picks up a stray detail, a stray gesture, a stray face in the room, and builds a biography around it on the spot. Shared jokes, years of wearing each other down, a specific afternoon when the friendship supposedly began. By lunchtime, the living room in Total Recall is holding a dozen characters who did not exist in the show a second earlier, and every one of them is confirmed by the memories of several family members at once. That is the engineering difference between a single lie and a network of lies. Hand somebody one isolated memory, and it collides almost immediately with something it contradicts: a date, another person, the basic logic of who was where and when. Memory is not an archive that checks each new entry against the old ones. It works as a system that lays new information down on top of the context already there, and it almost never goes back to inspect the seams. The parasite exploits exactly that. Rather than one fake detail, it lays down a whole context for the detail to sit in, and the detail sits there without a visible join. A lie stitched in from 2 or 3 sides by other people's corroborating memories stops feeling like a lie. It simply becomes part of the general picture of the house. By the middle of the episode, the house physically cannot hold all these sudden friends of the family. A raptor with a camera is drifting through the rooms taking photographs. A man called Sleepy Gary is standing in the kitchen, and he is not a neighbor who dropped by. In the implanted version of events, he is Beth's husband. He has been Beth's husband for years, and Jerry talks about him with the warmth of a man describing the best thing in his life. And her husband, Sleepy Gary, is hands down my absolute best friend, Jerry says. Then, to Gary himself, with total confidence, I've known you for 15 years. Jerry's marriage has been quietly rewritten out from under him, and he is delighted with the result. Each new guest arrives carrying a bundle of memories, his own and other people's, and the more bundles pile up in one living room, the harder it becomes to tell a real person from a planted one. The rule that finally cracks the house open is not found by Rick. It is found by Morty, and what pushes him to it is an insult Rick aims at him in passing. In the middle of the chaos, Rick tells his grandson that he has about 1,000 memories of your dumb little ass, and about 6 of them are pleasant. It is meant as a throwaway cruelty and nothing more. Morty hears the shape of an answer inside it. I figured it out, Rick, he says. The parasites can only create pleasant memories. I know you're real because I have a ton of bad memories with you. And Rick, who almost never concedes anything to anybody, concedes this on the spot. Holy crap, Morty, you're right. The boy who is treated as ballast for most of the run solves the episode, and he solves it by taking his grandfather's contempt and turning it into evidence. Test the logic on yourself. Think of anyone you have known for more than a couple of years, and along with the warm memories, there will almost certainly surface at least one small splinter. Putting that rule into practice turns into a nightmare almost at once. The family arms itself and starts working through the room one suspect at a time, demanding that each of them produce something unpleasant, something irritating, some old grievance. And it becomes clear very quickly that the method is far more dangerous in the room than it was on paper. The real people, the ones who simply have not given anybody a reason to complain lately, come close to being written off as fakes by the same logic that was supposed to protect them. Mr. Poopy Butthole is the clearest casualty of that inversion, and the show does not soften it. He is so absurdly sweet and so harmlessly pleasant that for a few seconds he becomes the most suspicious creature in the house, and Beth shoots him in the chest at the dinner table. Not a near miss, not a warning shot. An ambulance is called, and the call itself is one of the bleakest lines in the episode. There's been a shooting. My wife shot a longtime family friend. A season later, he's still talking about it on camera, still recovering from the bullet shot that I got from Beth. He was real the whole time. Was simply a rare person. The family genuinely had nothing to hold against, and the show clearly enjoys walking the audience into a false lead using a rule it had explained 30 seconds earlier. The psychologist, Elizabeth Loftus, spent decades on exactly this boundary between real and manufactured memory without a single parasite in the laboratory. In place of spores, she used leading questions and details slipped into an interview. In her best-known series of experiments, adults were told in convincing detail that, as children, they had been lost in a shopping mall. A substantial share of them agreed that it had happened and then started building the scene out themselves, what their mother was wearing, who eventually found them, how it felt to stand alone among strange adults. The finding, though, runs in the opposite direction from the one people usually assume. The implanted memories came out poorer than the real ones, not smoother. Fewer details, fewer words, fewer smells and sounds, and the subjects reported them with noticeably less confidence than they reported things that had actually happened to them. The false memory was never the more convincing account. It did not have to be. It simply existed, took up residence, and that was enough. This is the part worth carrying over to the house full of parasites, and it is not about polish. Not one of those planted friends is convincing on his own merits. What makes them work is that they are there at all, sitting in the living room, load-bearing, already woven into the day. Once a memory is in place, the mind stops asking where it came from and starts building on top of it. The numbers Loftus worked with are modest and stubborn. In the most cited version of the Lost in the Mall study, the sample was 24 people, and the false memory took hold to some degree in roughly a quarter of them. The procedure included a debriefing in which subjects were asked outright to guess which of the events had been invented. So this was never a matter of nobody noticing. The point is that a quarter of them had absorbed something that never happened from nothing more than a confident account delivered by somebody they had no reason to doubt. Later, the same body of work carried her well outside the laboratory into courtrooms where prosecutions had leaned for decades on recovered memories and nothing else. The show needed an alien parasite for this effect. Loftus needed a leading question and one steady voice willing to tell you in detail a story that never took place. Rick's own version of the problem is not a gadget in his pocket. It is a room. In Morty's mind, Blower's the erasure of a memory turns out to be a whole procedure with a whole architecture behind it. A chamber, a device that leaves the experience out intact, and a wall of glass capsules where the extracted pieces are stored, labeled, and numbered like exhibits in a museum nobody was ever supposed to visit. This is not something done casually on the way past. It takes equipment, it takes preparation, and somebody built shelving for it, which makes the routine of it worse rather than better. A single desperate act would be one thing. What the wall shows is repetition, planning, and a filing system. The archive is not dusty, and Rick says so out loud when Morty notices. There's no dust on it, because this isn't the first time we've done this. He has not merely erased his grandson's memories. He has industrialized the erasing, given it a room, given it an order, and brought Morty down here before, more than once, on days Morty no longer has any way to remember, and the twist that makes it genuinely uncomfortable is not the one you expect. The archive was not built behind Morty's back. It was built at his own request, over and over. This, Morty, is my archive of all the experiences you've begged me to remove from your life, lest you go insane, Rick tells him. And when Morty asks how long he has been asking for this, the answer is, since the first time your mind was blown. Every capsule on that wall is something Morty could not carry and asked to have taken off him. The consent is real. The horror is somewhere else. It surfaces as Morty starts injecting the capsules back into himself, at first out of little more than curiosity. One returns, a memory of driving an alien school counselor to suicide, a thing he did and then chose not to keep. Another returns the business of the true level, a piece of knowledge that reorganized how he saw everything around him. So he works through them one at a time, and somewhere in that sequence, the shape of the collection changes in front of him, because not all of these were his to ask about. Some of the capsules on that wall are there because Rick removed them for Rick's own comfort. Morty, sitting in front of the archive of his own life, asks the only question that matters. You seem to be in charge of what I get to remember. Why? That is the real inversion. Nobody stole his memory. He handed it over piece by piece in moments when handing it over felt like mercy. And then the person holding it started editing on his own initiative, and nothing anywhere in that arrangement gave Morty a way to know it had happened. Whoever controls what you remember controls what you are able to object to. Clinical psychology has a term for the opposite failure, confabulation, a state in which the brain fills gaps in memory with plausible but invented detail, without the slightest intent to deceive anyone. The person is sincerely convinced that what surfaces in his head is genuine. Neurology finds the classic version of this in Korsakoff syndrome, where somebody loses the ability to form new memories and, instead of acknowledging the gap, tells a confident and coherent story that never happened. This is not lying. The brain physically cannot leave the hole unfilled. The parasites from the opening of this chapter are performing confabulation from the outside, implanting the missing biography by hand into a space where nothing was. What happens to Morty is the mirror image of the same mechanism. Nothing is being built out here. Something real is taken away, and a hole is left in its place. And the hole, as it turns out, is something he starts to feel long before he learns what was removed from him. For years, the same meaningless whoop comes off the screen, and almost everybody, the audience very much included, hears it as nothing more than the main character's stupid catchphrase, "Wooba luba, dub dub dubbu." It first appears in the 5th episode of the 1st season, and it appears as a novelty, announced by Rick himself with obvious pleasure. "Wooba luba dub dubs. Yeah, that's my new thing." He shouts it in victory. He shouts it while showing off. He shouts it at nothing in particular. And it sounds exactly the way an absurdist joke with no bottom to it is supposed to sound. There is a bottom to it. It is revealed by the one character who happens to know the actual language. Not at a wedding, and not seasons later, but at a house party in the 11th episode of that same 1st season. "Morty, do you know what wooba looba dub dub means?" Birdperson asks, and Morty gives the answer any of us would give. That's just Rick's stupid nonsense catchphrase. "It's not nonsense at all," Birdperson tells him. "In my people's tongue it means, 'I am in great pain, please help me.'" Morty tries to wave it off, saying Rick must be saying it ironically, and Birdperson refuses to let him. "No, Morty, your grandfather is, indeed, in very deep pain. That is why he must numb himself." Notice how quickly this arrives. 6 episodes separate the catchphrase from the translation inside a single season, and before the translation lands, the phrase has been heard exactly once. The show does not hoard the meaning. It hands it over almost immediately, and then goes on using the phrase for years afterwards. That is the actual cruelty of the device. The joke does not turn unbearable in hindsight. It is unbearable in real time, every single time, because the audience has known since the 1st season precisely what is being shouted across that room, and the room never learns. The paradox is that both versions of the phrase are equally true, depending on who is listening. To anyone without the translation, it is pure absurdist comedy. To the one character who speaks the language, it is a years-long plea, said out loud, in a room full of people. The meaning does not switch between those two states. It exists in both at once, and which one you get depends entirely on who hears it. The strangest thing that happened to the phrase happened outside the show. "Woobalabadabdab" became an internet meme long ago, a slogan on shirts and mugs, cheerfully shouted at conventions and in comment threads by fans who know exactly what it translates to. A fictional man's cry for help turned into merchandise for people who could not help him if they tried. The irony inside the plot quietly grew into the irony of the fandom, spreading far beyond the episode where any of it was first said. Classical dramatic theory has a name for a situation in which the audience knows something the character on stage does not. Dramatic irony. Usually, the device leaves for one scene, at most one act, and then it resolves and releases the tension. Here it is stretched across years of airtime and dozens of formerly unconnected episodes, and the fact that it resolved at all is more the exception than the ordinary behavior of the technique. What the show does not do is pretend Rick is unaware of what he is saying. Birdperson states the opposite outright, and Birdperson is the only person in the room qualified to say so. And at the end of that same episode, Rick makes the point himself in the most Rick way available. Morty observes that this whole time, I haven't once heard you say that wobba lobba doob doof thing. Don't need to, Rick tells him. I have a new catchphrase. The phrase was never a slip. It was a channel he had chosen precisely because nobody around him was decoding it, and the moment somebody did, he closed it and opened another one. A man who screams for help in a language nobody nearby speaks has not lost control of his words. He has found the one way to say the thing and keep it harmless. Jerry Smith exists in this show, first of all, as a control group for other people's intelligence, against Rick's genius and the growing competence of the rest of the family. He is repeatedly the one who cannot assemble furniture without instructions, let alone navigate an interdimensional crisis. And yet in a handful of episodes, the thing Jerry lacks turns out to protect him precisely where the family's accumulated brainpower does not. Take Night Shame Aliens, where Rick and Jerry are both dropped inside an elaborate alien simulation built for the specific purpose of fooling a very smart man. The stakes are not decorative. While the illusion holds, the captors are working Rick for the formula they want, and there is no obvious way back out. What the show does with Jerry inside that machine is far more brutal than making him the hero. Jerry is no threat to the simulation, and the aliens know it. He notices nothing at all. And the reason he notices nothing is that his portion of the illusion is running at minimum capacity. They did not consider him worth the processing power. He wanders through a cut-rate rendering of his own life, has the best day he has had in years, and walks out of a trap built for a genius entirely unharmed and entirely pleased with himself. So what if the most meaningful day of your life was a simulation operating at minimum capacity? He's asked at the end, and the question does not dent him for a second. Rick, meanwhile, gets out the only way Rick ever gets out, by working out the shape of the box and feeding his captors a fake recipe. This is a harsher joke than the one about a fool stumbling onto the answer. A genius, almost by definition, reaches for the elegant solution. Somebody who has spent his life proud of his own ingenuity looks for an answer worthy of that reputation, and the machinery built to trap him is assembled out of exactly that expectation. Jerry has no such reputation. Nothing about him was worth modeling, so nothing about him got modeled, and the trap closed on empty air. It is worth recalling one of the oldest paradoxes in philosophy here. According to the story, the oracle at Delphi was asked whether any man was wiser than Socrates, and answered that none was. Socrates, hearing this, took it as a duty to test the oracle and went around the city questioning everyone with a reputation for wisdom. Each of them, on inspection, knew less than he believed he knew, and Socrates concluded that he surpassed them in exactly one respect. He at least honestly understood that he knew nothing. The only thing he was sure of was his own ignorance, and that admission is what made him wiser than men who were mistaken about the reach of their own knowledge. Jerry, for all the show's mockery of him, occupies a structurally similar position, though the show is colder about it than Socrates would have been. Jerry never claims to be clever, so in the rare moments of real crisis he wastes no time hunting for a solution worthy of his self-image. He acts as directly as he is able, and a world busy defending itself against clever people does not see him coming. Ask yourself how many characters in this show have that freedom at all, to act without first checking the answer against their own reputation. In a world built literally around a hierarchy of intelligence, where the number of Ricks in existence is limited, because one of them was once frightened of not being the smartest man in the universe, the one who comes true is sometimes the one who cares least about his place in that hierarchy. The four stories here strike the same spot from different angles. Somebody else's biography can be moved into your house like a parasite. Your own can be cut out and shelved, and the strangest part is that you asked for the first cut yourself. The meaning of your own words can be carried around for years without ever being heard by the person saying them or by anyone else in the room. And intelligence, the one thing that appears to belong to a person and to nobody else, turns out to be a far less reliable guide in a crisis than simply not being worth anyone's attention. Everything up to this point rested on one question: what you actually know about yourself and your own memory. The answer kept coming back the same: less than you think. What comes next moves the axis again from what you remember to what counts as permissible to do to a living creature once it turns out to be a spare copy. It opens on a single line of dialogue in which a Rick explains, without any apparent discomfort, what his grandson is for. Section 4. The most honest thing anybody in this show has ever said about Morty is said calmly, as a piece of engineering. Morty wants to know what he is doing there at all, and the answer comes back without embarrassment. You're a camouflage. Ricks have a very distinctive and traceable brainwave due to our genius, and the best way to hide from an enemy's radar is to stand near someone with complementary brainwaves that make ours invisible. That is the specification, not an apprentice, not a sidekick, not a grandson brought along because a lonely old man wanted company on the school run, a jammer. A boy selected because the particular texture of his mind blurs the signal his grandfather cannot stop broadcasting. Everything about the adventures follows from that sentence, and the sentence is delivered in the tone of somebody explaining why a car needs a muffler. The catch is that the same Rick will level half a city block for one specific boy, his own Morty, from his own planet. He will kill for him. He will die for him. And the two facts sit inside one man without visible strain. How does a single mind hold both of those at once without tearing in half? There is no formal contradiction here. There is a psychological one, and it is much older than the show. Rick's circle of real concern, like the circle of most actual people, was never a universal principle. It is personal, and it runs on proximity. Deep, genuine attachment goes to one specific person in your own life, while statistically identical suffering happening to people you have never met barely registers at all. Test that on yourself. News that someone close to you is ill keeps you awake for several nights running. A headline about tens of thousands of earthquake victims somewhere across an ocean takes 5 seconds between 2 clips in a feed and is gone by the evening. The numbers in the second case are larger by orders of magnitude. The reaction is weaker by orders of magnitude in the other direction. Charities worked this out empirically long before the show existed. Appeals built around a photograph of one named child with a story attached tend to raise more than appeals built around dry statistics about millions in need, and the effect has been documented more than once by Jenny and Lowenstein in 1997 and by Small, Lowenstein and Slovic 10 years later. It is worth saying plainly that modern pre-registered replications no longer reproduce it every time, so this is a tendency rather than a law of nature. The substance holds anyway. One photograph with a name on it lands harder than a summary about millions. Rick feels no contradiction here, and that is probably the most disturbing part of the whole arrangement. His concern was addressed from the beginning to one specific person, the one he raised, shouted at, and nearly lost for good. The category version of my grandson is too abstract for that kind of concern to attach to. With every other Morty in the multiverse, he simply has no relationship, and without a relationship his moral circle never switches on. The Citadel is where that private failure becomes civic. It is a city with districts and unemployment and an election cycle, and its underclass is a single face repeated to the horizon. The number of displaced Mortys is soaring. A news broadcast reports there, in exactly the register a local station would use for a housing crisis. Mortys are raised to be sidekicks, another line explains, and the word raised is doing an enormous amount of work. This is not a species that happens to be poor, it is a population bred for a function. And out on the streets of that city, the sign held up at the protest reads the way. Protest signs always read when they are stating something that ought to be obvious. Mortys are human, Somebody had to write that down on the citadel and hold it above his head, because it was not obvious there. The most efficient thing the show does with this idea takes place in a factory. Simple Rick is a Rick who was taken apart down to one good memory, an ordinary happy afternoon with his daughter, and that memory is not preserved as a mercy. It is a production input. We run it on a loop through Simple Rick's mind, and the chemical it makes his brain secrete goes into every Simple Rick's wafer cookie. An executive explains, walking a visitor past the machinery with the flat pride of a man showing off yield figures. The happiest moment of a father's life, played back forever so that the byproduct can be harvested and sold in a wrapper. The obscenity is not that somebody thought of it. The obscenity is the tone. Nobody in that room is whispering, and nobody is looking away. The citadel is not the only place where this indifference is packaged as entertainment. At Blips and Cheats, the arcade, the family drifts into almost by accident. There is a machine called Roy, a life well lived. Rick puts it on Morty's head, and Morty lives an entire human life inside it. A childhood, a marriage, a son, cancer, recovery, a career selling carpets, a death. He comes out shaking, having just lost a whole existence, and Rick's response is to take the headset, glance at the score, and reach for the next token. A full human life is a leaderboard entry. The principle is identical to the one running the factory, only here it has beer, games, prizes, and you can never tell what time it is. Concern that only operates within the radius of one familiar face goes further in this show than trading in bodies. It reaches the point where a body stops being the only thing a person is kept in. Unity is not a person and not a system in any ordinary sense. It is a distributed consciousness, one personality capable of occupying entire settlements and running thousands, sometimes millions, of separate bodies at once. And the planet is already unified when Rick arrives. That is the detail worth getting right, because the order of events reverses the moral of the story. Unity did not pacify that world for Rick's benefit. It had been running the place for a long time before he showed up, and its own summary of the improvement is delivered with real pride. Prostitutes are now scientists. The homeless are now philosophers. What Rick brings is not peace. What Rick brings is distraction, and halfway through the episode the war arrives, because Unity is spread too thin to keep holding the seam shut. Way to go, Summer, one of its bodies says. You started the race war. And then, quieter, the closest thing to an admission of weakness the creature ever makes, lost a little control. If Unity was a single consciousness the whole time, then its withdrawal means that consciousness simply moved to another body and left this one empty. If it was a multitude of synchronized minds the whole time, then its withdrawal is a million simultaneous awakenings, a million residents realizing at the same instant that somebody else had been moving their hands for them for weeks. There is a detail in this same storyline more revealing than any of the philosophy around it. Rick, bored, starts using a planetary consciousness as a private entertainment system, and the scenarios he demands get steadily more degrading. A stadium filled with naked redheads because he wants to see it. The stands packed with men who look like his father because he wants that too. Unity does all of it, and then Unity leaves him, which is the part that everyone remembers backwards. Rick does not walk out on her. She walks out on him by note because she cannot face doing it in person. Rick, forgive me for doing this in notes, the letter begins. I'm not strong enough to do it in persons. And then the sentence that reorganizes the entire relationship. I realize now that I'm attracted to you for the same reason I can't be with you. You can't change. I lose who I am and become part of you. Because in a strange way, you're better at what I do without even trying. As a being that swallows planets, that absorbs whole populations into itself as a matter of routine, is writing to explain that it is the one being absorbed. Whatever Rick does to the people around him, he does without a hive mind, without a virus, and without noticing. Before science fiction, the philosophy of personal identity almost never asked this question seriously. For centuries it argued about the soul and the body of one individual person, not about a self physically spread across 1,000 heads at the same time. the question does not become harder for being new. It becomes more awkward. Can one person exist whole in several physically separate bodies at once? Or does distributing a consciousness across many carriers inevitably mean that what sits in each body is a fragment rather than the thing itself? Imagine for a second that your own capacity to operate a body could be split into two synchronized streams and sent to two different cities at once. Each copy would be certain that it was you, complete with your memory, your voice, your habit of finishing other people's sentences. The question of which of the two is the real one stops meaning anything. Both are right simultaneously, and that simultaneity leaves the classical picture of a single indivisible self with nothing to stand on. Unity itself sees no paradox in any of this. It describes its own scale the way anyone else would describe growing up. When we met, I was a young hive mind with the population of a small town, it tells Rick. And then, without a flicker, people change, especially when I change them. Its ambition is stated just as plainly, and it is not modest. One by one, I will unify them. I will become the universe, and I will be what the single-minded ones called the God. That is not a creature wrestling with the metaphysics of distributed selfhood. That is a creature giving you its growth strategy. From Rick's point of view, the question stays open, and the show never once hands him an answer. Where does the metaphor of one person with an unusually large body end, and the more accurate description of 1,000 synchronized minds mistakenly believing themselves to be one thing begin? Ask yourself how many separate bodies you would be willing to entrust with a single consciousness, if you could divide yourself as easily as Unity does. The show takes no side in that argument. It offers both readings as equally plausible and leaves Rick, and the audience with him, holding a question that will not be answered in this episode or the next one. A small blue box. Press the button on top and a short blue creature appears in the room with exactly one purpose: to complete the task it was called for, and to stop existing the instant that task is done. Usually the whole business takes a few minutes. The demonstration Rick gives is deliberately trivial, because triviality is the point. Meeseeks, open Jerry's stupid mayonnaise jar, he says, and the jar is opened, and the creature vanishes with visible relief on its face. It wants to disappear. For a Meeseeks, this is just a job to be closed out as quickly as possible. The family, given the box, immediately reaches for things that are not jars. Summer asks to be popular at school. Beth asks to become a more complete woman. And Jerry, whose request will detonate the entire episode, asks for 2 strokes off his golf game. In Meeseeks, and destroy that request turns out to be the one that cannot be filled. It sounds simpler than anything the others asked for. Instruction is powerless against it, because the root of the problem is Jerry himself, and the mechanics of a golf swing have nothing to do with it. So the Meeseeks calls a second Meeseeks for help, and that one calls 2 more, and with every new blue body the garage gets tighter and stranger. The first of them, still locked inside an unfulfillable task, travels from cheerful helpfulness to a lost, shrieking creature that has forgotten how to form a calm sentence. And this is not the work of an afternoon. I've been trying to help Jerry for 2 days, one of them says, which is 2 days longer than any Meeseeks was ever designed to be conscious. By then the garage holds a crowd of them, and instead of solving the task, they start solving each other. One proposes shooting Jerry to close the problem on a technicality, another wants to burn the golf club, another just howls in a corner between the shelves. What binds all of them is the same feeling, pure and animal, the desperation of creatures forced to live longer than their own nature intended. Near the end, the first one shouts the line that will later travel across the internet detached from the episode entirely. Existence is pain to a Meeseeks, Jerry. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer had almost exactly this thought, without a single blue creature to illustrate it. For Schopenhauer, underneath everything alive lies a blind, unreasoning will to live, a force that continuously generates new wants. He located the source of suffering in that will itself, and treated external circumstances as merely its occasion. Life, in his own image, swings between the pain of lack and the boredom of surplus, like a pendulum, and neither end of the arc brings any lasting peace. Even a satisfied desire brings no peace for long. The next one grows in its place almost immediately. real peace for Schopenhauer is possible only in the rare moments when the will itself goes quiet. A Meeseeks is built without that will to continue existing at all. Its single desire is to close one specific task and then to stop desiring anything whatsoever, including its own further existence, which is precisely why an impossible task becomes a genuine hell for it. The creature is dragged into exactly the endless procession of unwanted wanting that Schopenhauer called the root of all suffering, and its entire being was constructed to get out of that procession as fast as possible. Think of the last time you desperately wanted something to just be over. Now multiply that by the fact that for a Meeseeks, it cannot end in anything except total non-existence, and an absurd comedy episode about a bad golf swing turns into one of the bleakest philosophical sketches in the whole show. The resolution, when it finally comes in a restaurant the Meeseeks have taken hostage, and it is not delivered by a weapon. Beth walks Jerry through the stands, one instruction at a time, standing behind him, patient in a way she almost never is with him. Turn around, straighten your back, bend your knees. I love you. He swings, and a Meeseeks announces the verdict with something close to rapture. He's got it, that's a lower handicap stroke. Then every one of them vanishes at once. The task was never really about golf. It was about somebody looking at Jerry long enough to help him, which is the one resource the box could not manufacture. Because if existing inside a story is already enough to drive a blue creature mad after 2 days of it, then the stranger figure is the one who appears to know perfectly well that he is part of a story and goes on living in it regardless. Mr. Poopy Butthole is not a minor neighbor who wandered in. He is a long-time family friend, described that way in the worst moment of his life by Beth's own husband on a call for an ambulance. By the 7th season, he is living in the Smith house, and every so often, precisely at the end of the most punishing stretches of a season, he steps out of the frame he belongs to, turns to the screen and speaks directly to the viewer, as though he knows perfectly well that somebody is on the other side watching him at that exact moment. The format of those addresses is always the same, and it is always short. A scene after the credits, about a minute long, one character alone in the shot. "Hello," he says, introducing himself by name and by episode number, and then explaining that he is still recovering from the bullet shot that I got from Beth. He asks how you are holding up. He wonders whether the season was hard on you. Then the credits finish and he is gone until the next one. Exactly once has the show given him a whole episode, the opening of the 7th season, which is about his divorce and his drinking, and about the family trying to pull him out of it. "The family wants you upstairs to deal with Mr. Poopy Butthole," someone says. "We got to help Mr. Starwastfasters. Poopy Butthole, he's in a bad place." And in that episode, notably, he does not talk to the camera at all. The moment he becomes a subject the show is examining, the channel to the audience closes. No other character in the show ever comments on those addresses. Nobody asks who he is talking to, or why he is speaking into empty air, as though for everyone else in that world, these conversations with nothing simply do not occur. His voice in those moments is no different from usual. The same friendly, slightly nasal tone he used earlier to ask someone to pass the sauce. The only difference is where he is looking, straight into the lens, as though he can see the studio floor beyond the edge of the drawn world. The rest of the show says nothing about the device, as if it were not happening. Mr. Poopy Butthole is simply the only one present who can see the fourth wall. Fans have spent years turning over their own explanations, from the joke that he is the show's secret director inserted into the frame, to the more serious suggestion that he is the one sober person in the multiverse who actually cares about the viewer on the far side of the screen. Not one of those readings has ever been confirmed by a line of dialogue. The writers appear perfectly happy to keep a dozen theories in the air without closing any of them. Ancient philosophy ran into a structurally similar trap more than 2,000 years earlier, with no cartoon to hand. In the story, a Cretan announces that all Cretans are liars, and the statement said about the speaker himself resists being settled either way. If it is true, then the speaker, being a Cretan, is a liar, and his own statement is false. there is a way out of that particular version, and it is worth being precise about it. One honest cretin is enough for the sentence to be simply false, with no contradiction anywhere. The genuinely closed loop needs the sharpened form, the one that says only this statement is false, because that version has nothing outside itself to lean on. Both are true and false in alternation, with no place to stop. A character who knows he is fictional falls into structurally the same loop, and into the sharpened version of it rather than the survivable one. If he is aware that he is a character in a script, then that awareness is either written into the script itself, in which case it is one more written line and not self-knowledge at all, or it somehow escapes the script, which for a being made entirely out of that script is not possible. This cannot be tested from the inside, and that is the whole of it. Any internal test Mr. Poopy Butthole could run to verify the authenticity of his own awareness would itself be one more line of dialogue written in advance by somebody else. Stepping outside the loop to look at it is physically unavailable to him, because outside the loop there is nothing there for him at all. The show has never explained what is actually going on with this character, and it has been on the air since December 2013, which is 12.5 years of not explaining it. That is not quite the same as leaving the thread untouched, though, and it would be wrong to call it the one permanently sealed mystery in the mythology. The post-credit scene at the end of the 8th season shows him held in a closed institution under observation. Somebody in that world has finally noticed that a man talks to something nobody else can see, and the answer they have arrived at is the one our world would arrive at too. The writers could have shut the question down with a throwaway line in any season. They chose instead to keep it moving slowly at the edge of the frame. Every time Mr. Poopy Butthole turns to the screen at the end of another brutal season, he is looking at the same point, the one where you happen to be sitting. Whether that is a coincidence, the show has no intention of clarifying. You are simply left with the look. Put all 4 chapters into one picture and what comes out is a surprisingly consistent system rather than a pile of random plot oddities. Identity in this world holds together by function rather than origin, and the show makes that case in the least comfortable way available to it. It does not have the family recognize their friend in the body of a bird. The family refuses. They keep calling him by the old name while trying to destroy the body wearing it, which is recognition being withheld, not granted. The one who acts on the lock-on answer is Rick alone, and he acts on it without stopping to argue. He climbs into the memory and pulls the person out of there, because that is where he assumes the person is kept. Time can be left formally untouched and still stripped of its price by side doors, a crystal that shows you the ways you can die, and a boy who starts arranging his life around one of them. A reality split by uncertainty and pulled back together 4 hours later. A wall around infinity, which the show attributes to no one in particular. They built it, and the pronoun is all we get. Memory and self-knowledge turn out to be built less reliably than we would like, not because the invented feels truer than the real, which is the comfortable version and also the wrong one. Loftus found the opposite. A planted memory came out thinner than a real one, with fewer details, fewer words, less confidence in the telling. It did not have to be convincing. It only had to be there. And a person's own voice can hide a meaning for years that the speaker himself does not hear, until somebody else translates it back to him at a house party. And even ethics inside a system of infinite copies rests not on logic, but on the plain, unkillable human habit of caring more about the specific than about the abstract. What holds me in all of this is the paradoxes themselves, or rather the stubbornness with which the show refuses to close them. The grandfather paradox has no consistent way out, not in a logic textbook and not in a garage with an unopened box in it. Free will inside a determined system is still an argument between serious philosophers centuries after that argument started. Whether the person who walks out of a cloning tank is the person who walked in has never had an agreed answer, and the show declines to supply one twice on camera with a vial nobody opens, by refusing to hand the viewer false clarity where no clarity exists even in academic philosophy. The series is more honest than most stories that raise questions like these, only to answer them conveniently a scene later. And I think that is why the habit of noticing what a fictional story leaves unresolved starts, sooner or later, to migrate into your own life. There is an old thought experiment about a ship. The Athenians kept the ship of Theseus in the harbor and replaced its planks as they rotted, and the ancient philosophers argued about whether what stood there at the end was still the same ship. Every one of us is that ship to some degree, cells and opinions and habits swapped out across decades while we stay convinced of our own continuity. Every one of us keeps memories that would not survive close inspection, and every one of us carries at least one box we would rather not open. Not because we forgot it is there, but because somewhere inside we suspect that opening it would mean no longer being the person who decided to leave it alone. If a breakdown like this one is good to fall asleep to, subscribe. I make them regularly. Good night, and I will see you in the next one.